Well, that was embarrassing. Apparently, I have been muted the entire time. So I'm going to try this all over again. Hi, I'm Carl Randolph, the producing artistic director for Transformation Theater. Thank you for joining us for this critical and often unspoken discussion on male sexual assault. A few things before we get started. I'm happy to announce our next virtual reading of Runtime Error by Elana Gartner, directed by myself, with dramaturgy by Gerard Taylor on May 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Find the link on our website for tickets and additional information. We want to hear from you during this conversation, so please post comments and questions in the chat, and we'll address them as time permits. We also want to let you know am I still muted? Oh, I'm not still muted. Okay. So we wanted to let you know that the conversation is going to be very sensitive and we can be possibly triggering. As such, please let me know that, please know that this can be triggering. So please take care of yourself first. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our guests. This conversation is being presented to address the subject matter of our upcoming reading, Runtime Error. Please welcome the playwright of Runtime Error, Elana Gartner.
Hi.
Hello. Director of the Sexual Abuse Study Group and service at the William Alanson Wright Institute in New York City, where he is also a supervisor of psychotherapy and is associate editor of the Institute's journal, Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Please welcome Dr. Ernesto Mujica.
Hello.
Our next guest is Nadia, I got her name wrong, my goodness. Naida Henao. She's the managing counsel for strategic advocacy and communications at Network for Victim Recovery of DC. Next,
happy to be
the
here.
Chief Operating Officer for Loudoun Citizens for Social Justice and Loudoun Abused Women's Shelter. Please welcome Samantha L. Clarke.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
And last, but not in any ways least, Angelus Evans. Angelus is the Manager of Community Engagement and Training for Turnaround Incorporated. Hello, Angelus. Your mic is off, my dear. Apparently, we all have this problem with our mics, especially me. So, hi, welcome.
Hi.
So, thank you all for joining us for this very, very critical discussion. It's an honor to share this virtual space with you, each of you. So, let's just jump right on into this important discussion. So, since this discussion is based on the themes of Runtime Error, let me start with Elana. The biggest question, well, two questions actually. Why this play? And really, who is the primary audience for this?
Thank you for having me. I just want to say that I am joining us from the Lenape land, Brooklyn, New York. This play, why this play? I never intended to write this play. My parents are both therapists, and my father particularly works with men who are sexually abused or raped as boys, and has since the 1980s. And so I grew up very aware about this issue. In addition, starting around the time that I was a teenager, some of my male friends started coming to me and telling me about their experiences without knowing about my father's work, and confiding in me. And that has sort of continued throughout my entire life. And so I've actually been aware both in a professional manner as well as in a very personal manner. Who's my audience? I mean, it's a very difficult play. So I think you definitely need to be over a certain age. I think this is not a TYA play. But I think ultimately this play needs to be for everybody, because we all need to have a responsibility to each other in this in the world, and we need to be aware, and we need to be able to talk about these things. And I think that if people are able to see some of these difficult topics and make it okay to talk about them, that it makes it easier for those people who have previously been hiding them to come forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is, I mean, and in addition, you know, I've had, so that's sort of some of the background. I mean, also I had the sort of initial, why did I never intended to write a play about this, and then it happened. There was, of course, the Me Too movement, and that was followed on the heels. It followed with the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and for me, that was the final straw. I was really, really angry. I could not tear myself away from watching those hearings. And I think that while there was so much that had come out the previous year in terms of Me Too, I think that the rage that I felt about this really took me over the top. And I started writing this piece out of anger. It was originally not focused only on male survivorship, but it had actually two protagonists. It had both a female and a male protagonist, and that became extremely complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm currently in grad school for my MFA, and my professor said that I should really try to focus on one protagonist. And I knew, given my own background, given all of my history, knowing the voices that don't get told, that I had to choose the male survivor in this particular protagonist role. So that is how this play came to be.
It's actually one of the reasons why we chose to select your play for our reading. For a reading is that you know, we spend a lot of time trying to find pieces that deal with subject matter that isn't talked about very often, and this is definitely one of those topics.
Yeah.
So this actually, you know, we're trying to, as a company with all these sensitive subjects, this is why we are doing these roundtable discussions, because it feels that we can't just present the play without some kind of responsibility to people that may be affected by it, or hopefully to allow anyone who is affected by it to have the resources and the potentially some empowerment to actually find assistance for themselves and find their advocates.
Yeah, so, and I certainly hope that is something that happens. I definitely hope that that's something that happens. I deliberately hope. I know that the Me Too movement was very focused on women coming forward, and I definitely champion that. As a woman myself, as knowing so many women who have had this happen to them, I definitely feel that the Me Too movement was extremely overdue.
Mm-hmm.
However, I also feel that it did not allow a space for male survivors, to be able to say that they also had those similar experiences. And I'm hoping that this allows them a space to recognize that if they haven't already, or to talk about it in a more comfortable way,
Mm-hmm.
and to make it okay for the rest of the community to look around and say that is okay for people to talk about it from a male perspective.
So I'm gonna actually just change the topic just a little bit and move on to Ernesto for a minute. So you contributed a chapter on sociocultural considerations in psychotherapy with male survivors of sexual abuse. And that this was for Richard Gartner's book, Understanding the Sexual Betrayal of Boys and Men. Uh, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience directly with male survivors?
Mm-hmm. Well, my initial experience in working with male survivors was with population age 6 and younger.
Mm.
I was working in the South Bronx, inner city population, um, and low income, poor families, um, where usually within that age group, you have a large proportion of children that are mandated for treatment by the state because there has been some form of abuse or neglect. Um, but we also had many children who had developmental disabilities or other mental health problems that were not caused by abuse, many caused by the very conditions of being poor. Um,
Mm.
but within the abused category, I initially was shocked that was 1986. Um, we were in the midst of course, the HIV epidemic as well as crack epidemic, and um, these children at such an early age had uh, already, suffered tremendously. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to continue to do that work because of the emotional impact. And it took me about 6 months to realize that I could myself emotionally survive it and also thrive within it, in that um, I felt that I was able to give a human benevolent connection and experience to children that maybe had not had such a connection previously. Um, so that's was my initial work, and I worked in the area for 3 years in early childhood. Um, Later, when I went for my postdoctoral training in psychoanalysis, I'm a clinical psychologist. And then afterwards, when I went for postdoctoral training in psychoanalysis, I actually then met Elana's father, Richard Gartner, who, when he realized that I had a background in working in the area of sexual abuse, he said, hardly anyone is working with men, so will you please consider that? So I said, sure. Um, but at first, I didn't have a primary orientation towards working particularly with men. I worked with adults as well as children and had male and female survivors. And uh, then he invited me to a conference in Oakland, California, which was maybe around, it was a few years later, in the mid 90s or so. And I was so struck by the dedication of the therapists that were there. Um, it was clear to me that everyone who was there was extremely dedicated, very serious about the work. And I thought, this is a therapeutic community that I would be really happy to work with. Um, Shortly thereafter, the Male Survivor Organization was born. It was founded also by Dr. Gartner and other colleagues. Uh, and then in 2001, Male Survivors started doing retreats for men. In 2018 or so, um, a new organization called Men Healing started running these retreats. I've been doing the retreats myself for about 15 years, and we've seen over 1,700 men by now. So I've worked with a very, very wide range of abuse and neglect of uh, young children as well as adults. Usually, we often use the term abuse when we're talking about children and assault when we're talking about adults. Um, and Most of the survivors that attend the retreats are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Um, we have survivors, of course, that uh, are survivors of male or female abuse, and spanning the gamut of all 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 subcategories of abusers. Uh, Family members who may be aunts, uncles, grandmother, grandfather, um, just very broad range, as well as children who have been trafficked. Um, and then for adults who have experienced sexual assault, um, uh, it's been really that was a population that was a little newer to me since I had worked mostly early on with children. Uh, but I've been struck with like how many businessmen on their trips may be abused. They may go to a bar after work near their hotel and um, think that they're just going to have a relaxing drink at the bar, and next thing they know, they've been drugged. Um, the bar closes down, and they may be the center of a sexual abuse episode, which ends with them being thrown out on the street at 5 a.m. in the morning.
Mm.
Right? So these kinds of things we usually don't read about because they're not published. And a man on a work trip who experiences something like that is not going to report it usually because it'll hit the media and so forth. So, you there's a lot in the world that is still unspoken. So I appreciate so much, um, and it's very moving to have Elana write this piece. Yeah, and for you to host it at your theater.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move on a little bit to Naida. So, Naida, as someone who's represented survivors in criminal cases and civil protection orders with the DC Superior Court, and you've also represented in Title IX proceedings. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Title IX perspective. The play Runtime Error deals a little bit in that area as well. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little perspective into some of the Title IX respect into these cases.
Yes, of course. Well, and it's tough to talk about the Title IX context for cases like this because ideally, we would want each survivor to decide what their experience is going to be like after a victimization, right? And so for some survivors, that may be reporting what has happened to them and then going through the Title IX process. Other survivors, and what we see commonly with survivors of child abuse is reporting until much later in life when they're not in school anymore and therefore would go through the Title IX process. But age is also an important factor too, because for example, we do a lot of representation of college and university students who presumably are over 18 and therefore get to, under the law, decide whether they want to report or not. Hopefully the schools are respecting their decisions whether to come forward, but that can look differently for children that are under 18. And obviously that gets to be a very tricky situation for schools, for parents, for support networks to handle, because regardless of the age, it's so important to respect how survivors are reacting to the victimization. Oftentimes, a lot of us want to get into that protective mode and think that reporting is automatically going to guarantee the survivor's safety. But what we see oftentimes is that it can be re-traumatizing if that's not what that survivor is ready for, if that's what the survivor wants. Again, depending on the age, that may have implications about being separated from the family or having to change schools, with the professor being afraid of retaliation and being scared of academic implications. So there's so much to unpack, and that's why Title IX, especially for students and children that are younger, can get to be so complicated, because oftentimes not only have they been, this act has been forced upon them, they have been assaulted, no consent is present there, but then they're taken, the choice of how to respond is taken away from them by, again, these systems that are in place, right? But that's not to say that's the experience for everyone. Title IX can be very helpful for a lot of student survivors that we see, especially because Title IX, in theory, I'm not promising that'll be this case in every single school, but in theory should be a supportive system for survivors, and not every Title IX process necessarily will look like an investigation and a hearing, which is what we often hear about in the news. But Title IX can also be a great source of support for a lot of students in that it can provide for accommodations. And so that can look very, very differently for each survivor. We've had clients that have decided to ask professors for extensions on exams and homework to help just give them some time to process everything that's going on, changing class schedules in case the perpetrator, like in the play, is a professor, or if they have a classmate that was the offender in the case, or changing dorm rooms, etc. Really, we try to advocate for whatever the client needs, so that can look very differently in every case. But I think Title IX, first and foremost, in the first line of response, should be a supportive mechanism before getting into any type of investigation or adjudication of what happened. But if the survivor, is receiving that support, then Title IX is one way for survivors to have an adjudicatory process and have some sense of accountability and safety on campus, which is really important for students because similarly to a workplace, but just because it's a different stage in development, school can a lot of times feel like a home away from home for a lot of survivors. And so that's why it's so important that school feel safe and for students to feel like the school is responding in a way that is supportive of what they're reporting and supportive of their needs throughout the Title IX process. And so again, talking about risk of re-traumatization when you have Title IX processes that are not trauma-informed, that are not thinking about referrals to mental health support, to any housing support, family support, to also help them react to what is happening. It can be very tricky because not only do you have the breakdown of the traumatization from the crime, but also the fact that this process is going on that's making you feel like you don't belong there, like it was wrong to speak out in the first place, that you wish no one would have found out. So it can be very complicated, and that's why even as an attorney, our organization really advocates first and foremost to like kind of take a pause and listen to what the survivor wants. We believe in survivor-defined justice, meaning that it's the survivor that really knows what is best for them. And regardless of how much we want to be protective, especially after something so terrible might have happened to someone, the best thing is to listen to what they need and then to be able to offer plenty of resources and available to them and to say, you pick what's best for you.
Mm-hmm. So kind of tagging into that, I'm gonna move on to Samantha a little bit, because I think some of your work actually, it doesn't maybe directly or does tie in with Title IX, but the work that you're doing, can you tell us a little bit more about what your focus is and what you're doing and how that with survivors and so forth that you're working with?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl. And just a quick note, my name is Samantha, but anyone can call me Sam, so I welcome my colleagues on the call to do that. So here at Loudoun Citizens for Social Justice and the Loudoun Abused Women's Shelter, and I'll speak a little bit more to that in a moment, it's relevant to our conversation today, is we provide comprehensive services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence, stalking, dating violence, et cetera. And I think that in providing comprehensive services, it's recognizing that, safety means different things to different people who've experienced, whether it's assault, domestic violence, in any facet of their interpersonal or intimate partner relationship. And so you may need shelter, you may be fleeing for your life. And so safety needs to be removing yourself from your home, your community, and we recognize that and we have that as a resource. It may be seeking legal advocacy, which we provide, and it's getting the consultation with a lawyer like Naida and making sure that you have that legal counsel that recognizes what your needs are as a survivor. It is survivor-centered, legal support. And that's critical. It might be advocacy that kind of meets you where you are. What is it that you need? What is it that you're looking for? What are your presenting needs? What does safety look like for you right now? It might be getting the locks changed on your apartment because you've been able to get a protective order, or you've been able to, that person who has assaulted you has been arrested, right? And so defining safety from the survivor is critical to our work. Our advocates are also, accompanying survivors to the hospital after there's been a sexual assault or a strangulation in a domestic violence case. So our advocates are trained to make sure that they're there with that survivor of an assault or domestic violence incident to be present in that moment where they need support, for a forensic or sexual assault exam. And so our advocates are there in those moments as well. And so that comprehensive array of services is really, really critical. When I mentioned that we are the Loudoun Abused Women's Shelter, a lot of domestic and sexual violence service agencies around the country, as well as here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, are recognizing that, we came about and we really grew at a time in the country when these services really, sprung up and got the funding and resources to really evolve. And that was, 35, 40 years ago. And the services were really centered around women because that's what we knew. As services have evolved in the last, 30 plus years, especially in the last decade, it's a recognition that we're now seeing survivors as we evolve and we communicate and we message better. We are really starting to see survivors come forward who are younger, who are survivors of color, who are male survivors, who are survivors who identify as transgender or are from the LGBTQIA community. And we have to evolve to meet their needs so they feel safe coming through our doors. And so organizations like Laws and many of our partners around the state and around the country are recognizing that our evolution has to meet the needs of our community. And we're doing that. You know, it's the name that sometimes is the last thing to change, because that's a challenge sometimes with organizations. But organizations like ours do meet the needs of all survivors in our community. And it's important that we communicate that, because oftentimes the stigma of being a male survivor of sexual assault, or even a male survivor in a domestic violence relationship, stalking, dating violence, any of these intimate partner or interpersonal relationship issues or assaults that occur, the stigma is so prevalent that they don't feel like those services are for them. And they are. And they're here and they're present, and the doors are open for our all members of our community, our male survivors or survivors that identify as male. And so that's a critical message to get out into the community. So I appreciate getting asked that question, because Laws and many of our partner programs around the country are here to serve everyone who needs us. So thank you, Carl, for that question. Anything else that I can offer in terms of services or comprehensive services?
Well, actually, I wanted to take what you were talking about with opening up services to recognize male survivors as well, as a theater company, viewed as an entertainment source, although we try to be a little bit more than that. The first thing that comes to mind is that in our industry, we all know about SVU, right? The SVU Special Victims Unit, right? And I knew you all going to get a laugh out of that, but we're talking about with Title IX and trying to take the perspective of the victim, and what is it that they want. And when I watch that show, as I watch with many shows or films that tend to take on this topic, they always seem to really want to force the victim into seeing it their way, or, it has to be, we have to take it to the criminal justice, that the perpetrator has to, and it seems to never really come from the perspective of the person who is trying to be a survivor right now, or who has just been victimized, and very little to no address on male victimization. And so I guess I'd like to hear from all of you on your perspective of, what do you think the responsibility of our industry is in helping to get this message out clearer and stronger?
I'm off mute, so I guess I'll answer first. So I think, Carl, one of the key things is, as we think about, what it means to be survivor-centered and what it means to bring voice to and give, whether it's representation or voice to survivors that we don't traditionally as a field, give voice to, is part of it is number one, reducing the stigma and recognizing that, and until we are all really seen as being accessible, open, available, and inclusive to male survivors, that door doesn't feel as open as we think it is. I'm very cognizant of the fact that, as a clinician, as a practitioner, as an administrator of programs, I think my doors are open, but I'm not a male survivor of sexual assault. I have to be cognizant of what is their lived experience, what is their reality. I know that I build a program and I communicate a message that says, I believe you. Our services, we have, we've changed our language. We don't use gendered language anymore. Whereas historically the language has been she, her, the female, right? And so we're very conscious and intentional in our practices, but I think it's also recognizing that we have to also then inform our practices from that perspective without kind of tokenizing male survivors. And I think that's really, really critical to understand. The other thing, in terms of like the SVU dynamic and how it's portrayed in the media, is I think when we look at systems and we look at the need for systems to work together and to be intersectional, one of the things I think is incredibly important for us to be very aware of is that there's a perception that for survivors to be okay, male, female, however you identify, for a survivor to heal or to be okay or to move forward, they have to have justice. And justice is defined differently for everyone. But if you're survivor-centered and you sit down with that survivor and you hear from that survivor and that survivor gives their voice to what healing and justice and the ability to move through, not necessarily beyond, because that trauma that they've experienced is a permanent part of their life. It's what do we do with that moving forward, and what does moving through that experience need to be for them? And a lot of times people say they need justice, or the system, the court, the whatever has to give that victim justice. And we don't define that for that survivor. That survivor defines what justice looks like for them. And it's not necessarily a prosecutor coming in, or the court or the criminal justice system coming in, or that person going to jail. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But I think a lot of times the media portrays justice as something that happens to or for a victim. And that is a process that I think the survivor should be allowed to internalize and process and define. So, because they carry that justice with them into their future. It's not something that once that thing that happens in court, and I'm not the lawyer, I defer to my lawyer colleague, but once that process is stamped and filed in the court, if they don't define that and own that, it doesn't give them justice. It doesn't give them peace. Like that is survivor defined. And so I want to pause and allow my colleagues to speak. But I think when media defines justice, it takes it away from the survivor. And so the narrative has to be reframed to say, how does the survivor, what does a survivor need to have peace, justice, healing, and that will change the conversation, and that will change how we view it.
I think that for me, theater is a way for society to have conversations about topics. It always has been. That is the job. It's, that's my job as a playwright, is to write things to cause audiences to self-reflect, to think about, things at a safe enough distance that they can consider what's happening without possibly making it entirely too personal, but also sort of making judgment about what's happening on the stage. And I think that for this particular topic, I think theater's been slow to get to this topic for a number of reasons. And I think that part of it is some of the stuff that has been coming out, it's been doing it to itself. Mm-hmm. We are finding out how much the industry, both the theater industry and the film industry, and I should say this goes across all industries, because we have really been finding out what's sitting underneath the moldy rug. But we are finding out, this Harvey Weinstein is where we started, not really where we started, because, there was the Catholic Church, there were private schools, there was the Olympics, there's sports. I mean, there's a large litany that we can go through. There are a lot of industries that can look themselves in the mirror or can't look themselves in the mirror. The theater industry has not been willing to put this on the stage for many reasons. And one of the reasons is because it is inherent in what it has grown itself into.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think, part of why we haven't seen it. I do not believe that that's okay. And that is why I wrote this. And I think that it is no longer okay for us to sit back and to say that we can't have this conversation. It is important to have this conversation. It's important for us to call our audiences and the managers and the producers on all of the things that they have been doing and that they have been allowing. And it doesn't, you don't have to be the person who is doing the abuse to be participating. If you are aware of something that is going on and you are allowing it, then you are participating. And if you are not saying, if you have had something happen, and again, this is like, if this is a survivorship and you are not ready, obviously don't, do what's important for you. But it is also, the secrets that have been kept have also allowed abuse to continue. And it has allowed people in power to prevent other people from moving forward in their career or abusing people to move forward in their career. Right? They have used those types of things. And I say that, and I am saying people, because it is not just women who have been experiencing this, it is also men. And I am being very specific about this. And that's why this play is about a male student who is abused by a male professor, because it happens that way too. It happens in higher education. It happens in many industries. So I'm going to see if other people have some things to say. I see that Angelus is with us now. So
Yes, I was about to say, before we lose her again, I'd like to bring Angelus in the conversation.
Let me just tell y'all, it has been rough.
And she's gone again. Oh, no. Oh. Well, hopefully we'll bring her back one more time. So in the meantime, let's continue on this vein of this conversation of responsibility, maybe even outside our own of the entertainment industry, but just socially, is there? I mean, what can we do? I think a lot of what I'm hearing and stuff is that. I'm curious. I think I'm going to kind of take a little twist too, in addition to this, and because male survivors have really been so not addressed until recently. It's pretty recent, I think, that we're hearing a little bit more, or that some people are feeling the willingness to talk about it a little bit more than has been. How do we help those survivors from long ago who never got assistance, who never found that advocate? What do you think about how do we help those survivors who maybe aren't quite survivors yet?
If I may jump in, and I think this actually is a nice continuation from the previous question, because I think in terms of your question of responsibility for like the entertainment industry and theater, is that really a lot of what is put in theater or movies or books is really an embodiment of like a greater culture of like rape culture, and the stories and the myths that we tell each other about what sexual assault looks like, who it happens to, who is the offender. And it's so interesting. My particular sticking point is a lot of stories that convey a professor abusing a student. If it's a male professor abusing a female student, people are outraged. But if it's a female professor and a male student, it's a story of seduction. It's a story of perhaps even like, oh, that lucky teenage boy who got this older woman. And those are the kinds of stories, whether they be a news story, whether it's a Adam Sandler movie, not to call him out, that's just what comes to mind. But those are the stories that I think keep a lot of survivors from coming forward, whether it's something recent or something that happened 20 years ago, because it's those stories telling them like, this is what's going to happen if you speak out about what happened to you. Like this, society doesn't see this as an assault, as abuse. Society doesn't see you as a victim. And that's what's really hurtful, is that people, unless, you know, you fit a certain stereotype, and this applies to LGBTQ survivors as well, that they just feel like, how are people going to respond to me in my experience? And is that going to fit into this like Me Too narrative, right? Does my experience matter to everyone? And is it worth like the potential, again, backlash that could happen and the consequences of coming forward? So I think to tie it all together, I think for me, it's just continuing to, thank you, Elana, so much, but to uplift these kinds of stories and to tell survivors directly and indirectly that like, we hear you, we see you, like this happens and your experience is valid. And if and when you're ready, like we're growing as a society to be more helpful, to adapt, like Sam was saying, to provide better resources, to have better conversations about what has happened.
So, I mean, I can, I know that part of the issue for male survivors is believability, is getting people to believe them. And I will say that from personal experience, that especially when you look at someone like myself, people don't believe you. And especially in the past, you know, I mean, I'm of a certain age, and, you know, so back in the 80s, you know, if you were to tell someone that you had been assaulted or that someone did something that they shouldn't have done, especially if it was by a woman, there is no believability. At least there wasn't. So, you know, how do we help continue to encourage that perspective as well? Because, yeah, believability is, I mean, I know a lot of women struggle with that as well, but definitely for male survivors, it is definitely a large issue.
One thing, and sorry, go Ernesto, you take the floor.
Oh, no, that's okay. Samantha, go ahead, and then I'll go after you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What I will say just briefly, because that can be a very, very complex issue, but in terms of victim services or working with survivors, the bottom line is, no matter what, we start by believing, right? And because you hear that narrative of like, well, they've changed their story, or they lie, or that person, you know, they've come in a couple times, they've changed their story. They, you know, and that the reality is none of that matters. When a victim or a survivor presents to us or to a survivor serving organization, we always start by believing. You have a reason to place yourself in a position to be that vulnerable, and that, I'll just say vulnerable, to say, I have been harmed. I am a victim. This bad thing happened to me. Regardless, we believe you. And I think because some people start to try to say, and start to kind of change that a little bit in terms of what, and it's like, when you come from a place of we believe you, no matter what, and we build from there to meet your needs and to help you get what you need to heal, to find safety, to get resources, to you have to start from that place, because if you communicate anything else, they're not going to come in the door, because that vulnerability, that risk to think I'm going to be traumatized again, re-victimized, they're not going to believe me, I'm going to, right, none of that can be part of it. It's unconditional positive regard, unconditional, we believe you, and we're going to start from that place so you feel supported, heard, and validated. And then we take it from there. Because only from that place can, to your point, Carl, only from that place can a survivor who was, raped last night, or a survivor who was experiencing child sexual abuse 30 years ago, or who experienced an assault 10 years ago. They all have that vulnerability and take that risk when they say, this thing happened to me. And we have to start from the same place of believing them and building trust and safety so they can begin to heal. That is fundamental. And I'll pass it over to Ernesto.
Thank you, Samantha. There's a couple of points that I just wanted to touch on, and wanted to actually go back to what Samantha had said earlier about the difference and the distance between how public settings for support to survivors, how they view themselves versus how a particular survivor or male survivors will experience entering that setting. It's taken me years, many years, to develop more sensitivity to that. And still, after about 30 odd years of working in this area, I still miss some of the cues sometimes. Case in point, today's meeting, the way that it was listed, it was titled as male sexual assault. Now, the general population is going to read that and they're not going to think male sexual victimization, right? They'll think, oh, this is about males who have committed assault. Because that's where the bias is in the general population. The other is that it lists 1 in 6 male-to-male sexual assault. We're not talking about just male-to-male sexual assault. We're talking about male victims, male survivors. It's male survivors of sexual assault. And it's not just male to male. A lot of compulsive sexuality, including in heterosexual males, may come from having been victimized by male or female perpetrators. I've known and worked with men who were sexually abused during school by female teachers compulsively, where the teacher would take the child, let's say, to her home after school and have sex with the boy, but over many months, and arranging things, let's say, to with the parents to say, I'm going to take care of Jimmy after school, make sure that this and that, because I know that you both work very hard and blah, blah, blah. This kind of thing can lead to then dissociative sexuality, and it happens with female survivors as well, who may be drawn to compulsive sexuality as a sequela, right? An after effect of trying to deal with the chaos that developmentally is brought about by rape at a young age. With regard to theater and film, young aspiring actors and actresses are so vulnerable. And I remember in the 70s when I was in college, my teachers were allowed, there was no objection ever from the administration or anyone. My teachers were allowed to have sex with their students that was never even talked about. And we didn't know any better. It was a time when, the kids themselves didn't necessarily repeat to their parents, I'm having a relationship with Professor so-and-so, because the parents may object. But certainly among the faculty, it was very open. And it was something that was, I never heard a word against it. It's different nowadays, thankfully. But still in the later 80s and even early 90s, I've had patients who, as students, were, became sexually, pursued and or, were raped by a professor. The schools, you mentioned, Elana, public schools, private schools in particular. Private schools, often the faculty live in housing that is located on the same campus. There's in Catholic schools, the housing has traditionally been linked between the classrooms and where some of the priests may live and nuns. And children can be pulled out of class and brought into a priest's or nun's quarters, be abused, and then return to class. Right? So all of this has taken place with people stretching their necks to look the other way. So we have a situation that's been going on for millennia. And I think it's just the first time in the history of this planet where, because of the internet and because of a certain level of consciousness and awareness and an understanding of what is abuse, what is perpetration, what does consent mean, who can give consent. This is where we're at now, thankfully, but and where we need to continue to push forward. Yeah.
We're going to try to bring Angelus into there again. So, Angelus, how I'm just going to let you, like, what is on your mind, and what do you want to tell us about your organization and so forth, and how do we become better advocates? Angelus is still muted.
Is Jordan unmuting her?
Yeah, Jordan, are you doing that for us there, sir? Ah, she's there. Nope, she isn't.
Oh, see, when she unmutes, she gets kicked off. That's why he was.
Yes. Ah, we lost her again. Ah,
Onward.
I'm so sorry. Okay. We'll move on. We'll get her here somehow. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I had some answers also to what you had asked earlier, Carl, but I did want to let Angelus talk since she was here.
I know.
But hopefully she will come back. But in the meantime, I mean, I guess one of the things that I definitely want to bring up is the there's a perception, particularly for men. I think it's harder. It's hard to come forward for men because of the machismo factor. Men are supposed to seem very strong, and they are supposed to not be sort of capable of being overpowered by someone else, whether that is by a man or by a woman. And so the concept that could happen is very hard for someone to admit that it has happened. And I think that if we as a society can come to that understanding better, and that we make it okay for machismo to go away a lot more, and that that men don't always have to be so strong, that men can be vulnerable, and that that's okay, that I think that that will be what we can do to allow those male survivors to come forward and to say, I was taken advantage of, and I was hurt, and someone did this to me. And I think that will allow for more bravery. And I say that from the other side of I'm saying that from the communal side. What can we do? I don't, I think there's always the, creating safe space, in any conversation, just knowing, if you, I mean, I don't know. I end up sensing when somebody has something to say. My husband calls it my superpower. And perhaps that's why people have been telling me these types of things since I was a teenager. And I have had to know because I was a teenager, I also had to know when I had to ask for help, because I was a teenager. But over time, I learned how to handle it better on my own. If someone is a teenager and someone reports something, they should definitely go and ask for help, because you should never, as a teenager, be having to shoulder that on your own. And, it is, if someone has confided in you something that you feel that you cannot handle, then you should also go ask for help from someone who you feel is better equipped. And without breaking the confidence, I think is the right thing to say, because you don't want to break the confidence of the person who has confided in you.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to be able to find the resources, or you need to be able to help the person who has confided in you, because that's what we really need to be doing a lot better. Is we need to be taking care of each other a lot more. We need to say, I was hurt. And this goes across lots of conversations. And okay. This goes across lots of conversations. I was hurt. I need help. And therefore, what can you do to help me with that? And I see that Angelus is now going to join us by voice.
Are you with us, Angelus?
I think so.
All righty.
I think I am. I think I'm here.
Wonderful.
The floor is yours now.
All righty. So I was just hearing bits and pieces. The last question that you asked, Carl, because I heard you all whenever I was on, as far as just how we can be better advocates. One of those ways is certainly to continue to have whole spaces like this. It's very interesting. I know nothing about film other than sitting down and watching it. But I think that it's really important, because a lot of the ways that I even educate myself specifically about how men experience sexual violence against them is oftentimes through having to really dig through films, whether that be videos I find on YouTube, actual movies that have plots, whether it be plays, whether it be, and I wouldn't even just say in film, but it's somewhere written or somewhere being broadcast. So it's also really important that this film has been written, that this is happening, and that people will be able to kind of get a lens into what being a male survivor could look like. I think that by being a better advocate, we also have to be able to support local resources that are providing the work and being innovative about creating those spaces as well. A lot of times, male survivors in particular, they don't really have a place to turn, no pun intended, with my agency being called Turnaround. But they really don't have that place to kind of look to. Oftentimes, male survivors, they're more responded when it comes to seeking support in more peer settings. They have to absolutely see themselves when they are reaching out for help. So again, nothing against my organization, who does absolutely wonderful work, but we are predominantly female organization, although we do service survivors who are women, those who identify as that may not identify as male or female, children. We service all, array of people. However, it could definitely be a deterrent when you go for services and there isn't representation there. There aren't people who look like you. So it's really important for us to be able to show up in those spaces and or support those type of spaces where people are being really innovative, when people are gathering together, even if it's just a survivor-led space, creating spaces for that as well. Obviously, with me being in prevention work, prevention is absolutely critical and crucial, in my opinion, intertwining that with advocacy as well, whether that be just victim-centered advocacy and that basic service level, or whether that be really organizing survivors together to fight different legislation, to fight local, systems and spaces that exist that are not making it easier for people to show up and identify as survivors. So those are just some of my initial thoughts as far as how we could be better advocates, not only having these spaces, but making sure that we're bringing up these conversations with our peers and our spaces. Because a part of combating particularly sexual violence as a whole is is constant battle of fighting stigmas, right? So men, they have a whole other layer of stigmas that they're fighting, and part of that is normalization. It is a normalization of things. Again, I heard chunks of what people were saying, but the shame, the guilt, the fact that men are taught from a very young age that there's a very specific way that they have to act and that they have to respond to things, and it's just really. It's not something that is normalized for them. So we have to do the opposite of that. We have to normalize the conversation. We have to normalize men supporting each other through this experience. It's interesting. The other day, I was having a conversation with someone and they asked me what was my favorite thing about men. And I said, their ability to hold when society doesn't give them a lot of space to express their emotions. Now, I say that just because I'm impressed by their ability. I'm not at all do I say that because I think that they should be doing that they should be holding emotions, that they should be not able to speak out and be vulnerable with the people around them. But that is the way that we have socialized. And very much this sexual violence, we know the statistics, we know the numbers, that it is something that largely affects women. But again, hearing pieces of what you all were saying, it is definitely true that I think that it could be just as prevalent, but it really is already hard for survivors to come forward. It's even harder for male survivors as well. And the point was made earlier, like when we first got on about even the title of this event, and I just couldn't agree more with that. Like people could read that and very much associate that with perpetrators, but we also do have to hold space to identify that boys, men are experiencing this too. We really have to be champions. We have to continue to have the conversation. One of the ways that we approach prevention work in my department, or my community engagement and training department, is to, I wouldn't even say make the topic fun, but make it easier to talk about. We go into spaces and we do activities with people. We get people engaged as much as we possibly can. And it isn't always this very somber thing or this thing that we kind of want to keep behind closed doors. It very much, a big part of this really is normalizing these conversations. So I couldn't appreciate you all more for creating and making sure that people see it displayed somewhere, but also holding spaces like this and having the foresight to say, let's have a roundtable about this. We're putting this film out here, we're supporting this, but actually let's address the core the core issue and the thing that's going to be displayed in this film. So I think that is really wonderful. If I just highlighted a little bit about Turnaround, as I started to say before, Turnaround is a local nonprofit that services Baltimore City as well as Baltimore County. And all of our services are free. We offer a number of wraparound services stemming from clinical therapy to case management to, we do actually run an abuser intervention program. We specifically serve survivors of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, as well as human trafficking. Another dynamic, obviously, is our community engagement and training department, which is where my department really faces out to the general public to continue to do that prevention work. We have a goal, we have this vision to end sexual violence. And I do think on top of providing supportive services, we very much have to continue to be in a preventive mindset and a preventive space, and really working with survivors to feel empowered, to get involved in things like advocacy, to get involved, to lead these conversations, to be a part of these conversations like the one that we're having tonight. So, yeah.
So there's been this conversation about the thing that's come up a little bit, and Elana brought this up about the machismo aspect for men. But so there's, and we've been talking about gender identity a little bit as well, that between male and female, but now there are, we're aware of multiple identities and how people identify. So
Right.
the question I have here for everybody is that there seems to be this perception that if you are a male that is assaulted, that it's going to affect either your sexual orientation or your sexual identity. Is that true? And what do you think about this? Ernesto's gone this one.
Well, that's such a common, frequent issue. And it depends, of course, on the culture within which that particular man or boy lives. In a city like New York, there's a lot more flexibility in understanding gender. I've done some communications work with victims in conflict zones through the UN. The UN held a number of years ago, too long ago, and has only held, that I know, one weekend meeting to address issues of male survivors. But in Bosnia, for example, men in prisons were used to portray sexual plays that would be written by those running the prison. And up to 80% of the men were sexually violated.
Mm.
In the Congo, you have children, males, being raped as a way of forcing them to join young militias. And sadly, rape in war, which can occur to men as well as women, and is often not addressed, is a way of destroying, so-called destroying a man in certain cultures. So if you rape a man, that means you have categorically removed his manhood. Therefore, he can no longer be a soldier.
Hmm.
And in some countries, men who have been raped during war may be also left by their family or their wives, because literally they're no longer considered male. Okay, it's very different than how we may picture, things here, but it's a worldwide issue. But in our culture, there is a fear that if a boy is sexually abused by a male, they may become gay, or if a boy is sexually abused by a female, they may become gay, because he'll fear, the gender of their perpetrator. In actuality, that is generally not an issue that we run into in working with survivors. Their sexual orientation is, from my experience, not greatly affected by the fact of their rape or the gender of their perpetrator. What is maybe affected for a period of time developmentally is a sort of disorientation as to, do I even like sex? Or do I like too much sex? Why do I even want sex when this is something awful? So it leads to a lot of confusion about sexuality itself, or difficulties in being able to enjoy sexuality. Yeah, rape doesn't make boys gay. That's often a fear of the parents, and parents also notoriously, as well-meaning as they may be, tend to not respond well to the first report by the child of their violation. So if the child is already an adult, it's not uncommon for the parent to say, "Why are you telling me now? You should have told me then. I can't do anything about it now." The parent is angry about their helplessness in the moment, and actually then it attacks the child or their adult child. Um, the if the if the victim is gay or bisexual, then automatically people in the family and friends, if they come out as having been raped or sexually molested during childhood, there's an assumption that it was the abuse that made them gay or bi. So that's inescapable because it's in the culture. It's very, very much in the culture. And and even within the gay, so-called, gay community or gay communities, sometimes there's great intolerance for variability of sexual orientation. Men's gender and sexuality is extremely highly policed. The gains that women made with the feminist movement have made very little gains, in terms of men, very little gains. They're way behind. And the male body is defined as impenetrable by society. So when a male body is violated, even symbolically, through sexual molestation, it automatically implies that that boy or man is less of a man. It's a category that absolutely includes impenetrability. We also use the male body for war, for, more broadly, for violence, for violent entertainment, boxing, kickboxing, all of this stuff that people are still entertained by. So the male body and its impenetrability is such an integral part of our culture that when a boy or young man comes into, which I've experienced in my patients, I've had patients who've gone to the clinical services at a university and said that they were raped, and that the interviewing therapist saying, "That's impossible. You were sexually molested. You weren't raped," because they're male. And until 2013, in fact, the legal definition of rape also made it essentially impossible for, and I don't know if Naida has some information about that from a legal perspective, but made it virtually impossible to prosecute based on a charge of rape. You know, a male could not be raped.
And that can still be a problem in a lot of places where even just the definition of rape, like you said, even though they've updated it, because before you had sodomy as a separate crime. What's interesting now is even as we use the term rape versus sexual assault or sexual abuse, rape in most legal definitions is penile and vaginal. And so if you have different body parts, you don't get to be said to have been raped. And like that has an impact because most lay people use the term rape when they're talking about sexual violence. And so when your victimization isn't called that, it feels as though it's not as important, it wasn't as bad. And so that's why it's been very important to have more inclusivity in our language about how we talk about sexual violence and to not limit it to certain body parts or certain genders, to be able to allow for more inclusive experiences.
Yes. Could you clarify, Naida, that if, for example, forced oral sex performed on a man would not be considered rape, but it would be considered rape if it's a female?
Well, it depends very much on each state and how it defines its laws. For DC, most places now, it doesn't matter the gender. Instead, you have different categories of sexual abuse or sexual assault more based on what type of sexual contact there is. So you see a lot of like breast or buttocks touching being usually more like a 4th degree or misdemeanor sexual abuse. And the more penetrative sexual assaults tend to be the higher degrees. Again, not because they're more important. That's just how the laws have been codified. But there may be some states that still have it based on gender, but I think that most have now moved away from that. But you're right, in the 80s, sodomy is the historic term that most people are familiar with, which made it a separate offense, and it wasn't really considered a sex crime per se.
Right. Thank you. And there's federal law as well for these terms?
Yes, there are federal laws as well.
Right.
So we're kind of running out of time here. This is definitely a conversation that I think could go on for a very, very long time, and we'd still need to have longer to really get to really deeper into this conversation. So I'd say let's just I want to kind of wrap this up and just say whatever last thoughts that you'd like to present. One of the things I didn't talk about was actually that I wanted to get into, but we kind of didn't get time, was a little bit about, who tend to be the perpetrators as well. But I think we kind of talked about that a little bit as well, because I think it would be surprising to a lot of people who perpetrators could actually be. And that actually, I think, leads a lot into the credibility of the victim when they're like, nobody's going to believe that this person did this, whether it be their status or their gender, or it's surprising that, and to realize that it could be anybody who could be a perpetrator, and our society still will still not necessarily believe it.
Yeah.
So, whatever last words that you would like to share, feel free.
I've with the men that I've worked with and children, there have been perpetrators, as I said earlier, from every category of family relations, including grandparents. In one family, there was a female line of perpetration in the family. So there were aunts who had sexually violated their nephews across generations.
Hmm.
So, but of course, then from there, teachers, medical professionals. I mean, I think we've become more aware of this in the media, that we've learned about all these different, categories of potential perpetrators. In the retreats that we do, up to 50% at times of the perpetrators of the men that are present, and there's usually between 25 and 30 men present at any given weekend retreat. Sometimes as many as 50% of the perpetrators are female, which was a surprise even to us, who are used to working in this area. And of course, the reporting, has been mentioned, the reporting of a female perpetrator is much more difficult to do. Even in group therapy, when there are men in the group who have been perpetrated by their mother or a grandmother, an aunt, the shame and the hurdles there can be more challenging, even though the other group members are always, warm and receptive and supportive. But of course, we idealize the role of the female as caregiver, and so the vulnerability that we feel in society to know that these gendered persons that we have, assigned as our primary caregivers can be our primary perpetrator is just too horrifying to think about.
I think too, it's important to remember that peers are also one of those things, one of those people that can be perpetrators. And it's not something that is necessarily always considered. It could be siblings, it could be friends, it could be cousins, it can be people who are at the same level. It doesn't have to be someone who is an adult who knows what they're doing. It could be a peer who is either doing it because they are trying to get more power, or because they are experimenting and using someone's body for that. And then, so it can be, it is more common, and the myth that really does need to be, I think, sort of, it is very common for people who are sexually abused or raped to know the person that is the perpetrator, and that there is very often a grooming that happens, which is not something that we've really talked about. But there is people who get lured in. I mean, my protagonist is someone who gets groomed, and the perpetrator in this particular play, that's his thing. He grooms everybody who he is trying to sort of trap into his world. And I think that it's not it's a very, very common situation that we don't see, and that you know, and that's a lot of what we, you know, trust is it's at the very heart of all of this. It's, you know, when it is violated, that's what is at the heart of this. And so it doesn't have to be a stranger. It often isn't. It is often somebody that the person, the survivor, knows.
I'll chime in and say my kind of parting thoughts. And, you know, on the who victimizes men, I think it's the narrative in society is that, you know, men can only be harmed or hurt, much to what Ernesto said in terms of like how we portray men as, you know, they are protectors. They are the soldiers. You know, we portray them as being, you know, the violence in society, right there, that strength and all of that. So I think there's this image and this narrative in society that the only people that can hurt them is, you know, the big scary man in the dark that overpowers them and takes that strength away from them, right? We meet violence with violence. And so that's the narrative, is like, how could they hurt you? Like, you're bigger, you're right. And it's that myth and misperception that men can only be hurt by bigger, stronger men with more violence and more strength. And it's, you know, and you know, Elana, you mentioned this idea of grooming. And when we think about power, control, threat, coercion, force, grooming, these things can take many forms and happen in many ways and come from many people. And they are designed to harm. They are designed to take power away and to violate trust and create harm, right? Create an environment where harm and violation can occur. And that can happen to anyone, including men. And our society needs to come to terms with that. And we need to have that dialogue and that conversation that opens up the realization that it doesn't have to be the bigger, scarier man, you know, or person that takes the, you know, strength away from them. That it's not about strength meeting strength. That's not how men are harmed in our society. I want to give kudos. I think it was to Angelis that mentioned consent. Thank you. Consent is so powerful. Consent is so needed. We're starting to have these conversations about consent. It's just so incredible that the preventionist that works in our agency and preventionists I've had the pleasure of working with in different communities, we're having these conversations about consent with elementary school kids now, right? And healthy relationships and what it means to feel safe in a relationship. And that is so needed. And I cannot stress that enough. I think it's part of changing the trajectory. And it's part of creating safety for everyone. And I just think it's so critical. You know, and the last thing I'll say real quick is Ernesto, that question or question about, you know, just being a victim, you know, make you gay. You know, Ernesto captured it so eloquently, so I won't reiterate anything that he said. But one of the things that I have done in my career as a clinician is if I have victims come to me or survivors come to me and the harm and trauma they have experienced as a victim of sexual assault or childhood sexual abuse is conflated with their identity, right? It's this really bad thing happened to me and I'm gay, or I think I'm gay, or I don't know what I am. And the two are like this. It's really doing the work of helping them understand that their identity and who they identify, you know, what they identify as in terms of their sexuality or gender identity or orientation or all of those things, right, does not have to be permanently connected to this thing that happened to them. And it's helping them to separate the two. You know, this harm that you've experienced, this trauma, this violation, does not always have to be connected to your identity. You can be a healthy, you know, sexually vibrant gay individual who is safe in your identity and have experienced this harm. And the two don't always have to be connected. But they come in the door being like, am I gay because, you know, did this happen? Did this thing happen because I'm gay? And it's the work of beginning to pull those two things apart and really understanding that they don't necessarily have to be connected. So I've enjoyed that work with individuals that I've had who wrestle with that and have trauma and identify as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. So those are my parting words, and I will yield the floor to one of my colleagues.
I'll close out as far as my final thoughts. I think that one of the things that I would like to do, because again, we throw around this 1 in 6 statistic a lot, and when you really break that down, right, if you think about it in the sense that if you are in a football stadium of 100,000 seats, right, when you break down that 1 in 6, that means, and it's all full of men standing up. When you break down that 1 in 6, it's going to be about 25,000 men who have been victimized. That is staggering, right? And I think that one of the things, because a lot of this conversation, it really just circled back around language, right? And I know personally, I often feel like I shouldn't be speaking about something when I don't belong to a certain population of people. But I do think that we could be doing work as far as how we are showing up as providers, but also how we're just showing up for our friends and family who may be dealing with these types of things. And I want us to consider, when we leave this conversation, I want us to think about men experiencing sexual trauma and how we are assessing their trauma and modifying our language to be appropriate for our response to them. Male survivors of sexual trauma may not present to treatment specifically for trauma-related issues sometimes. Even so, sometimes, like, for instance, when you say you have a psychiatrist, they should be considering exploring previous or current sexual trauma when, like, talking to them and asking things like, how have you had unwanted sexual experiences? Again, because of things like we mentioned, like the definition of rape and how that doesn't feel inclusive. So sometimes you really have to kind of think about even our language on how, when someone is kind of struggling with something and you know that they're trying to like come out about some type of experience that they've had, but we really have to readjust and kind of be aware of how we shift our language. It's also really important for us to really think about sexual trauma in regards to how, it makes people feel unsafe, and, there's a distrust. When you're thinking about, you really have to, if you're in a position of being a provider, you really have to not present yourself in some type of hierarchy, that the person is coming to you to be fixed in some type of way, but really making the work collaborative. And again, I'm saying that in the context of being someone who is a provider. However, again, this is a very easy thing to do for our audience out there if you are just showing up for the people that you love and care for in your life. And also, just, again, what I said earlier, as far as providing integrated additional services and resources, and really making sure, hopefully, that they're free, hopefully that they're informal, and again, that they are they have some type of peer-centered dynamic, because again, people really have to see themselves. It's just like when we first go to a movie and you see someone. I was talking to someone earlier about The Bachelorette, one of the bachelorettes who had a big forehead. And I'm a big forehead girl, and it is nice to see someone who looks like me. And it's the same way, especially when someone has dealt with something as serious and in depth as a sexual trauma, that they have to see. I cannot reiterate that enough. They have to see people who look like them. All right, and that goes whether you're LGBTQ, whether that's you're Black, Asian. It has to be that representation there. And I think that, again, with language, even though we have these statistics, even though we know it exists, somehow we struggle to see men as targets of sexual violence. And for whatever reason, it's difficult for us to comprehend, and it's definitely difficult for them to comprehend. So we really have to make sure that we are also bringing them into the conversation and upholding them as survivors as well. And because that language, again, depending on, some people like to be identified as a victim, some people like to be identified as survivors, some people don't like to be identified as either. But I know that the goal of identifying someone as a survivor is really rooted in resilience and empowerment. And because of the lack of control that this person now has because of this experience, we should always be operating in a space where we are supporting them to regain that control, to be empowered, and to be able to, again, get into a space where they're able to lead conversations like we're having tonight.
And if I may, just quickly and shortly, although that's a tough act to follow.
Sorry, Nadia.
No, but just echoing all my colleagues' message about language, and to not only be mindful of how you're talking about these things when someone is disclosing to you in that moment, but also when you're just talking about it generally, because survivors are listening to how you're communicating, even when you may not be talking about them specifically. And so when you make the jokes about rape in prison, or when you're talking about teachers having sex with students, like, call things by their proper names. There are certain situations where people cannot legally consent, for example, for someone who's underage, someone who is incarcerated. There are many situations like that. And so it's important to use the terminology that will make the survivor in your life that you may not even be aware of know that you're on their side because of the language that you're using when you're not talking about their victimization. So that is really important. And then lastly, circling back all the way to the beginning and talking about Title IX and echoing the importance of free resources that really are mirroring the clients that they serve. I would also just put an asterisk on confidential resources, especially for younger survivors. Again, however good intentioned you are, survivors should not be shoved into a process that they did not choose or were not ready for. So making sure that whether it's a school or any other institution, that there are confidential resources that are available so survivors can go and talk and learn about their options without being forced to report in that moment.
That was a great segue in that we're going to actually put up the resources that we have, and to let everyone know that these resources will actually be posted with this on our YouTube station. They will also be on our website, available for folks, both in conjunction with this roundtable, as well as in our presentation next month of Runtime Error. And while that is scrolling through, I really want to take the opportunity to thank each and every one of our guests tonight. You have all been extraordinary, and I'm so excited that Angelus was able to finally at least be able to be heard. I treasure your insights and your advice. It was absolutely essential. And thank you so much for taking your time to bring your voice to this subject. And I encourage everyone, if those who are listening, if you are someone who has experienced this situation, or that you know of someone, please utilize these resources to get the advocacy and the assistance that you need. And with that, I say good night, and thank you all for your participation. And for those in the audience who are watching, thank you so much. And have a great night.
Thank you.
Good night, and thank you, everyone.
Yes, good night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Good night, all.